Are you a hard worker? If I had to guess, I'd wager that you use self-reports in your research, or at least read research that uses them. But you might think that as long as participants have no incentive to lie, you should have no problem. I will argue that questionnaires can be biased, even when participants are being truthful, which has important consequences for researchers, policymakers, and interventionists. So are you a hard worker? Imagine you're a student answering that question. To respond, you must bring certain information in memory. One particularly interesting memory might be of how you compare to other students in your grade. In the case on the left, all of our classmates are usually very hardworking, and in comparison, you might seem only sort of a hard worker. Now consider the case on the right. Comparatively speaking, the student now seems like much more of a hard worker. And even if she's equally hardworking in both cases, she might now say she's definitely a hard worker. In the same way in which visual perception is affected by the objects in the background, our perceptions of ourselves will be affected by those around us and the reference points or standards that they set in our minds. Reference bias is systematic error that arises when participants use different implicit standards to respond to the same questionnaire items. This means that two people with the same level of a trait might report differently if they do not share the same reference points. Early evidence for reference bias came from experimental evaluations of charter schools. Results from these evaluations suggest that charter schools increase objective outcomes, such as college enrollment and test scores, despite not increasing self-reported self-control. There are two potential explanations. Either charter schools change behavior without changing the underlying personality, or reference bias obscure the effect, because charter schools also raise the standards that students use to judge themselves. Similar evidence from cross-cultural personality research also provides paradoxical results. In survey studies of over 50 countries, Japanese citizens consistently rate themselves as less conscientious than American citizens. Does this represent true country-level differences in conscientiousness, or is this just a measurement artifact? Research suggests the latter. In one study, the more cultural experts rated a country as having a particular trait, the less the country's citizens endorsed that trait. In another study, objective markers for conscientiousness at the country level, such as the efficiency of post offices and the accuracy of clocks, negatively correlated with country-level differences in self-reported conscientiousness. This mismatch between self-reports and other validity criteria points to reference bias. However, this evidence might not be conclusive. In the first case, the cultural experts might be biased, and in the second, the behavioral proxies might not be valid. So let me show you some data we collected for almost 22,000 students in 62 schools. We find that, as expected, students with higher GPAs rated themselves higher in self-control. Now that we have controlled for a student's GPA, the following coefficients represent the effect of classmates' GPA for two students who might behave very, very similarly. Consistent with reference bias, students reported lower conscientiousness when their near peers, that is, students in their classes, had higher grades. And far peers, students in the same school but not the same classes, had no bearing on how a student rates their conscientiousness. How did this relate to the standards that a student holds for what does it mean to work hard? Students with higher grades tended to have higher standards, and these standards were informed by their classmates. On the other hand, task measures of self-regulation were not contaminated by reference bias in a longitudinal study of over 1,000 adolescents. Within schools, tasks and questionnaires both positively predicted college graduation, but across schools, only task measures did. But where do we get these standards from? What kinds of peers shape our self-perception the most? An obvious first target are friends, with whom we spend a lot of time. On the other hand, peer role models, or people we think embody a particular trait, might provide particularly useful information. In a study of 1,100 adolescents over 2 years, we find that, as before, students with higher GPAs tended to rate themselves higher in self-control. However, while the GPA of their friends had no bearing on how they rated themselves, when their peer role models had higher GPAs, they tended to rate themselves lower. In a pre-registered replication and extension with almost 6,000 adults in 6 domains, we found similar results. Taking exercise as an example, people who exercised more were more likely to report higher self-control for exercise. People with higher standards for exercise, however, tended to rate themselves lower in their self-control for exercise, while at the same time actually exercising more. How much your peer role model exercised had about double the impact of how much your friend exercised on your standards. However, your behavior was more similar to your friend's behavior than to your role model's behavior. Why does all this matter? This means that questionnaires are not a clean representation of a person's traits. They also encode features of the social context. This means that using self-reports in a policy context to compare people from different groups who might have different standards is a fraught exercise. It also might help us explain the null findings from charter schools. If an intervention, such as attending a charter school, changes our self-regulation as much as it changes our standards we use to judge ourselves, self-report questionnaires will fail to detect this change. Similarly, correlational research might also underestimate the effects of these traits. For example, self-reported level changes of conscientiousness across the lifespan may be underestimated if the reference groups participants use to judge themselves against also change across time. So, are you a hard worker? Responding to such a question requires looking within to identify the patterns of our own behavior. In addition, the evidence for reference bias presented here suggests that knowingly or not, we also look around, especially to our peer role models, when deciding how to respond.